Today we know that those patterns do not have to repeat themselves.
Hi, hello, and welcome to Coffee Literature Review. I'm Chris Hendon, and today I'm joined by Doran Pennington. It's our pleasure to be talking about an article published in Food Science and Nutrition. The title is Effects of Coffee Roasting Technologies on Cup Quality and Bioactive Compounds of Specialty Coffee Beans. This article, unfortunately, promises more in the title than it delivers. The premise of the article is simply that you're going to take 3 different roasting technologies, 3 different coffees, and you're going to try and then use a sensory panel to determine which technology gives rise to the best tasting coffee, and therefore should you be investing in one of these technologies at your farm, at the washing facility, whatever. Unfortunately, there's major chemical problems throughout. There's a design of experiments issues and statistical problems, and we'll get into that a little bit more. And helping us to get into that is veteran in the coffee industry, a professional in all sense of the word. He's been working in green coffee purchasing as a consultant for different roasteries and cafes, thinking about coffee programs broadly, helping people develop roast profiles, helping them develop green coffee purchasing programs, and also recently starting up their own roastery, Aviary, out of Ohio. We're very grateful to have you here today, Christopher Feran.
Hey, thanks for having me.
How often do you get to dive into the scientific literature?
I dive into the scientific literature of the coffee world as often as I can, honestly. I think it's really important to keep abreast of what industry research is saying. Obviously, it tends to lag a little bit behind what people at home are doing, what professionals are doing, but it can validate some of our approaches, save some time, give us a better, more robust understanding of what goes on.
Sure. So you're not a stranger to reading articles that are at least aesthetically appear to look like a scientific article like this one.
Sure. No, not at all.
Yeah.
That was diplomatic.
Well,
I mean, I think that was my first comment was the introduction. I was like, oh, can I rewrite it?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, this is one of the things. So you've actually touched on a good point, is that like sometimes when you're reading science, there's this requirement, if you're going to publish it in an even vaguely reputable journal, that you need to write in English. And of course, that presents challenges for people from other countries. And we'll note then that this article is coming from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia.
Right.
So, I mean, of course, it's important and like close to home science in the sense they care deeply about making sure their coffee tastes good.
Right.
But at the same time, they're presented with a new challenge in science, which is to convey these scientific concepts in a language that is not their own.
Mm-hmm.
What were your initial thoughts on the paper? You went through and read it. I sent it to you, and you like got back to me with notes within like 40 minutes.
I mean, I just tend to work quickly, but yeah, I mean, I have a whole list of annotations throughout this paper, sections highlighted, cross-referenced, read through some of their citations, which disagreed wholesale with the way that they extracted them, which was really interesting. At the end of the day, I'm scratching my head because, you know, it seems like they're trying to answer one of the most fundamental questions that every roaster seems to have at some point in their career, which is, what machine should I buy? Which machine is going to give me the best coffee?
So, Christopher, I have a question. Could you kind of explain the general way that coffee gets roasted? And then could you also tell us the difference between a drum roaster and a fluidized bed roaster?
Sure. So coffee essentially starts out green. We look at the precursors that we transform in the roasting process using heat, which can be surface contact or hot air, some combination of both, radiation. We transform those precursors into what we know as roasted coffee over some period of time. The chemical processes that take place are quite complex, and they vary a lot based on how you apply that heat, what we call a profile. In a traditional drum roaster, you can think of it kind of like a cement mixer where you put the coffee in the mixer and then you have a flame underneath. In indirect fire roaster ones, you have air passing over the flame that then passes through the drum. So you have some mix of convection, conduction. Others are just the heat under the drum. In this case, in this experiment, they're using one where it's literally like a cement mixer with the heating element under the drum, and then air passing through just to pull out your chaff or your smoke or whatever. A fluid bed roaster or an air roaster uses hot air, kind of like, I like to talk about cooking in cast iron versus cooking in the air fryer is like a very crude way of understanding, especially looking at our traditional roasting here, which is, they didn't describe it in the paper, but I assume that's what they mean is cooking cast iron, open fire sort of situation.
Whenever you're roasting coffee, could you explain what you're in control of and what things you can change?
It depends the machine that you're working on. Say in Ikawa, for example, it's a set it and forget it pre-programmed roaster. So you on this version, you have the control over either your inlet temperature, which is the temperature of the air coming into the roasting chamber, or you have control over your exhaust temperature, which is the air leaving the roast chamber just above that coffee pile. And the roaster will use a PID to attempt to achieve that temperature curve as you have programmed it. You also have control over the fan speed, which can somewhat influence the convective heat transfer, but really has to do with the mixing and tumbling of the coffee. In a traditional drum roaster, you have control over your drum speed, your flame, your amount of air passing through the drum. Those are typically traditionally your levers.
So we have an Ikawa in our lab, and if I have a curve that I use here for our green coffee just so we can turn it brown and do science with it, and I took that same curve with me up to Addis Ababa and took the same coffee, even hypothetically the same coffee, I'm going to get a massively different result out of the Ikawa, right?
I mean, frankly, you're going to get a different result if you have two Ikawas in your lab and you put them side by side.
Okay. Well, there's that too. Yeah.
So there is that phenomenon. But yes, I had to change my standard curve substantially in Addis Ababa to make it perform equivalently to the control that I brought. Addis Ababa is at 2,300, 2,400 meters above sea level, which means that the density of the air is quite a lot lower. If you're using an air roaster or some sort of highly convective roasting machine, the amount of energy that air can hold, or the convective efficiency of heat transfer actually decreases. So it changes the way that you need to roast and apply heat to the coffee in order to get an equivalent outcome. So just in December, I spent about 3 days working with a Probot barrel roaster and a Cafe Logic, trying to sync them up. Oh, as well as an Ikawa, trying to get equivalent results between the three machines. And you had to take very different approaches to get ostensibly the same cup outcome. So it's not as simple as put coffee in, turn it brown. You actually have to understand somewhat the heat transfer that occurs.
Right. Okay. And so this, in this case, because you're going to lower altitude, you're going to be, higher altitude, excuse me. You're going to be going to higher temperatures, longer roasts, right?
I actually went to a faster roast, which is really interesting.
What? Okay, so you got to tell me about this. Why?
Yeah. So I did a bunch of reading from so I have a roost machine. And so I did a bunch of reading from the aerospace industry. They were basically looking at how you can cool silicon chips, PCBs, at high elevations. For the aeronautics industry, of course, they need all of their planes are controlled by computers now, and they have to cool them with fans. You can cool with water, cool with fans, whatever. And they basically found that the higher you go, the less heat that air can actually carry. And so that's a problem for chips burning up. It's also a problem if you want to transfer energy into a coffee bean from a heating element. Mm-hmm. So what happens is the heating element will continue to heat at that same rate, but the fan will not carry that heat into the coffee as efficiently. So what I had to do was lower my fan speed, essentially, to keep that air in the roasting chamber and in the coffee, which decreased my lofting. It increased the temperature of the interstitial air, and it also increased the rate of transfer. I then had to actually lower my inlet temperatures, which was interesting, and I ended up with overall about a 30-second faster curve.
Wow. This is really not intuitive. Like, this is basically the opposite of what I just said. So that's good. There's also a reason why this Christopher sits in a chemistry laboratory and that Christopher is doing all the wonderful things with coffee, because I really have no idea how I would have arrived at that without just doing trial and error. And I think you rationalized it based on reading scientific literature, which is really impressive, actually. You spent some time trying to compare or dial in or make two different roasting not only manufacturers, but also like two different ways of introducing heat to coffee. Mm-hmm. Talk to one another, commute. Is this something that people should do? Like, is this a thing that people should think about?
It depends what your objectives are. I would say yes. If you are sample roasting coffee, looking to make purchasing decisions, then it is essential that you be able to taste that coffee as neutrally as possible. And by that, I mean you should be able to see its flaws as well as its qualities. If your roast in some way diminishes or hides certain problems or potential problems or uniformity issues with the coffee, or if it highlights some rather than others, it's not going to give you a very objective understanding, as objective as you can be with taste, of course, but it will bias you in certain ways or blind you in certain ways. So I do think it's very important to dial it in and understand how your roaster impacts coffee.
We'll turn our hand to the paper here for a second. They source 3 coffees, seemingly specialty coffees. We can talk about whether these are actually specialty coffees or not based on their imagery and the supporting information in a minute. From the Sidama, the Harar, and the Yirgacheffe region of Ethiopia. They are then going to roast those 3 coffees on a fluidized bed Ikawa, a drum roaster. In this case, I need to remind which one is the Probot?
Yeah, PRZ4, yeah.
Yeah, the PRZ4. Oh, yeah, classic. Yeah, and then also what they call the traditional method. Christopher, what is the traditional method? This oven top, they call it?
It's unclear to me, but what I inferred was that is the Ethiopian traditional method,
Right.
which is essentially roasting coffee on an open flame in cast iron pan, and you agitate with usually a wooden spoon.
I have an Ethiopian national in my laboratory, and he invites us over, and we do the coffee ceremony at his house, and it's very enjoyable. The whole process is
Sure,
awesome.
yeah.
And he has coffee that he's brought from his home producing region. He's actually kind of close to the Yirgacheffe region, and his wife prepares it for us on the pan. So I've seen this before. I'll tell you what seems to be easy to do on the pan is that I think maybe we all agree that it's pretty easy to identify when coffee is really dark.
Yeah, that's right.
And it's pretty hard to hit a standardized color of like light or medium, quote unquote, on that sort of technology, that pan with someone agitating it, because you don't really have the control of any heat other than what? Just surface contact, right?
Right. Yeah, and it's not like you're using a gas flame where you can, slowly eke down that propane. It's just hot.
Exactly. So it's not really surprising then that technology is probably going to be the worst performing, because it's inherently going to increase the amount of variability in just all cases, because you're relying on a human and an unstable heat source to apply heat to coffee.
Right.
So they're doing this study to try and make a statement about which roasting technology is going to give you the highest cup score, which brings a question up, which is, are there any coffee farms that are selling coffee which have been cupped by this traditional flame top method, or do all coffee farms generally have some kind of fluidized bed or drum roaster?
If I understand what you're asking, then essentially no. Coffee that is exported from Ethiopia, export grade coffee, all will pass through labs, either formerly through the ECX, the Ethiopia Commodity Exchange. They have quality labs that will do this sort of evaluation using like the Probot style roaster, or third-party private export companies, almost all of whom will use similar technologies to this or the Ikawa.
Yeah. Now there are other examples of small portable, relatively cheap roasters on the market. I'm thinking Link, for example, is an example of one you've probably come across, right?
Yep.
And one of the things about Link or Ikawa, for that matter, is that if you have this like pre-programmed set and forget roasting profile where you're applying some fixed inlet temperature, whatever you're doing, right? You have your fan speed is whatever. It's actually pretty easy then to systematically hit quote unquote darker, because you can just extend the end temperature by a couple of, up the end temperature by a couple of degrees and extend the roast by a couple, 30 seconds. You're going to get steamingly systematically darker. I'm by no means a professional at this, but I published myself where we've tried to make different colors of coffee, and I've received different levels of feedback from people saying like, oh, you can't really trust the different different sensors in the Ikawa for whatever reason. And it's not the Ikawa's fault. It's just that it's hard to make a measurement of temperature, when you care about the bean temperature and you're measuring anything else but bean temperature.
Right.
It's hard, but at the end of the day, I'm still able to make coffee that looks like coffee, that is progressively darker and darker, and no one would be upset that these are representative roasts of coffee, right? When you're roasting coffee, and if I were to ask you to provide me a light, a medium, and a dark roast. We could define that through Agtron or just visually or however you wanted to. What would you control to access light, medium, and dark?
I mean, fundamentally, at the end of the day, what I'm looking at is my final temperature of the bean probe. I would control everything I have in my power to optimize the curve to bring out the flavors that I want to, which might be desirable for that roast level. But that's, at the end of the day, it's really just that temperature.
If you then were to read this article, you'll find in table 1 that this is the 3 different coffees roasted on 3 different technologies to 3 different colors. So inevitably, if you're keeping track here, that should be what, 3 times 3 times 3, which is 27, right? Am I right? But somehow there's only 24 entries. If you're looking at the data here, the weirdest entry here, did you by chance happen to catch coffee number 2?
2 drum?
2 drum, light and medium.
Oh yeah. How 2 medium is 91.6 and light is 90.3.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was interesting. I also caught that the light on the Ikawa for 2 was 97.8 Agtron.
Yeah.
By far the lightest thing. It's yes.
So then I think we could summarize this table as saying that these authors struggled tremendously to systematically roast a light, a medium, and a dark for 3 different coffees on 3 different roasters.
I would not hire this roaster.
So I have a question. Is roasting natural coffees inherently more challenging? Do they tend to be more variable than washed coffees?
I mean, they're more variable in the sense that there is less sorting that happens inherently through the process in terms of density and size. But I find them incredibly easy to roast. Actually, they develop fairly readily. So I don't find that to be the case.
You took their Tron values, the numbers that we just mentioned, and the different roasting technologies and the different coffees, and you put them into a table.
Yeah.
Why'd you do that?
I found them to be a lot easier to visualize when they were decoded and actually presented in a way for human consumption.
Yeah.
It helps you see the holes in the data a lot easier.
What's the biggest problem?
I mean, the biggest problem is that they didn't run the traditional pan roast on the Sadama coffee at all. So you only have two samples for each of the roast levels. Yeah, it's incomplete.
It's incomplete, but also there's a problem like this. If you think about just coffee number 1, whatever it is, it doesn't matter what it is. Just coffee 1, I think it's the Yirgacheffe, and they go for light, medium, and dark, and their light is 90.3. Their medium is 62.7, and their medium, again, is 56.6. They were unable to get that coffee to dark. Or a different way of saying that is, in my lab, 56.6 actually is venturing on dark for us. So
sure, yeah.
So they were unable to get it to medium. They just went from like really light to all of a sudden dark. Like there's nothing in between. And I did the same as you. I wrote it out in a different table format myself, and I was like, they didn't manage to roast a coffee between 38 and 62, except for one example. Like they totally missed out on like a whole wedges of color.
Right.
But then the paper goes on to fold all of these into 3 categories: light roast, medium roast, and dark roast. And figuring out how they did that was like, is very, very challenging.
I find it inexplicable, honestly. Like if you have a higher number, then that should be the light one, not the medium one.
Yeah, and you look at the pictures of the coffee in the SI, and I think it becomes clear why the numbers are so different. It's because there's like 75% Quakers in the coffee.
Did you by chance open up the supporting information?
You missed out.
No, so we're going to open it. No, we're going to open it. We're going to share the screen with you, and we're going to have your snap reaction. We're going to have the real-time Christopher Feran first viewing of their roasts.
Okay.
So one second. Yeah,
right.
It's going to provide some clarity to this paper, I think.
Yeah, this is going to have everything that I asked for, I'm sure.
Oh, I doubt it.
Can you see this?
There it is. Oh, my initial question was what quality are they using of this coffee? Like the Harar looks very polished. The Yirgacheffe, it looks almost brown. I don't know if that's just how it's coming across on my screen.
No, that's right. Yeah.
Same with the Sadama. So these look like lower grades to me, but they could also be past crop. Who knows? Oh, look at that Quaker count. That's yummy.
So Yeah, so the following photo is the roasted sample for the traditional method. This light roast coming out of the traditional method roaster
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
it is an abomination.
They look like pistachios.
Yeah. That's something.
Uh-huh.
I can't even comment.
We actually have recorded another pod, episode 2, with Andrew Tolley on the whether Quakers negatively impact the cup score. And it's a nice article that we reviewed because it makes the case that up to 10% Quakers, and you can't really detect them negatively in the cup. But in this case, we're looking at the quality of coffee and the supporting information, and you're seeing like 50 to 70% Quakers in some of these examples.
Yep.
And yet they're allegedly scoring over 80 points as a specialty product. I mean, does this even make sense? What do you think?
It doesn't make sense to me. I mean, their cupping practices also really don't make sense. They're grinding very coarse. Boiling is much lower in Addis Ababa because of elevation, so that doesn't really make sense. So I guess if you're not really extracting the coffee, perhaps it makes sense.
Yeah. So you probably saw their cup characteristic scores.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
If all you did was just read the table here of their scores, their quality assessments, you would say that Ethiopia produces the sweetest and most uniform coffee on earth. Because of these 3 tasters, every single one of them, for every coffee on every technology, scored a perfect 10 in both uniformity and sweetness.
I'm impressed. I guess if you distribute your Quakers evenly, then you can end up with
Yeah, although I don't think people usually say, hey, 70% Quakers is mighty sweet.
That's true.
So I have a question for you, Christopher. On table 3, they're showing the moisture content of only the Yirgacheffe coffee roasted on the different technologies. And something that jumped out to me is that between the light roast and the medium roast on the drum roaster, they get basically the same moisture content, and it doesn't really start to drop off until you get to dark. And we've already talked about why that is maybe an issue with the Actron reading, because they're not really different. But have you noticed, or have you found it to be the case that drum roasters in particular hold on to moisture more than a fluidized bed?
I don't really want to generalize because it depends on how you approach that roast. It certainly can. If you have a gradient happening in your development between outer and inner, then certainly you would find that this is the case. And I think that I recall them saying that they liked the medium roast of this coffee. And perhaps they just like some sort of gradient of development.
Before we get into the chemistry side of this, I want to make sure that you don't have any notes that you really need to say about the beginning part of this paper.
I mean, it just hurts me every time I see that coffee is the second most valuable commodity after oil. It makes my skin crawl. It's like it's not even the top 100, let alone the top 10. So yeah.
No, they said the first sentence of the paper is coffee is the most worldwide accepted beverage.
Accepted.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I agree with you that I myself in 2016 wrote an intro that said that, and I cited the same article that these people cited, and I have not yet since then I have not done that again, because first of all, motivating it as an economic thing is one thing, so then the paper better be about economics associated with it. That's just good science writing. Your intro needs to reflect what the heck the paper is going to be talking about. But then in the next paragraph, they talk about health, okay?
Yeah.
And so then you're thinking, okay, so is it economic or health? And of course, health is related to chemistry. We're going to talk a little bit about the chemistry and problems with that exact part of the paper. You somehow end up as being the first paper on this podcast that we're going to talk about that I think this is truly a surprise that this article made it through peer review the way it did, because this is really like every single data point that they collected, every single one in this paper, I would have, if in my laboratory I saw this, I would have told students that is in the trash. You got to go back and do a better job of collecting it. Every single data point. There is not a single data point in this article that I would use. Here they go on to show 9 charts, which I would have put all in one chart. And in these graphs, and they basically show that as you roast coffee, you lose some stuff, but there really is no trends.
Right.
And what would you glean, as someone who was reading this to try and learn what to do and what not to do, what would you glean from figures 1 through 7, which are just charts of compounds being lost or destroyed or whatever during roast?
I mean, I would glean as you roast, things go away. That's pretty much all I can get from that.
Yeah. Well, there's one compound that actually does appear during roast, and that is acrylamide. Now, acrylamide is a compound that people believe is related to causing cancer and neurotoxicity and other things. It's thought to be carcinogenic because once it enters your body, cytochrome P450 will turn it into an epoxide, and then it will start to interfere with your DNA, and inevitably DNA damage and interference is what gives rise to cellular misfunction, and as a result, you can start to exhibit cancerous type properties. So in principle, then, acrylamide might be bad. And a lot of this stemmed from a series of papers published in Nature around the turn of the millennium. But because, you got to zoom out for a second, think about where acrylamide comes from. So you basically take asparagine or methionine, and during the Maillard reaction, which is the browning step of roasting, you roast anything that has amino acids, whether they're in the form of a protein or free amino acids. And then they have to also be in the presence of a sugar or a carbohydrate. And together, they are going to generate a variety of compounds, some of which taste good, can be perceived as sweet, and inevitably you're going to get some of this acrylamide. So anytime you cook toast, anytime you roast coffee, you make popcorn, you name it, you're going to get some of this stuff. And so the thing, though, is it's really small. It's a small molecule, so it should be volatile. So in principle, the darker you roast, the more you should make, because you break down more of the proteins and it reacts with more of the carbohydrates, but also you're driving it out of the roaster. And so inevitably, you might then expect to see that the darker roasted coffees should have perhaps less acrylamide because it's exited the roaster. And then separately, the different roasting technologies should probably give you somewhat different concentrations, whether they're open to air and letting it, just evaporate or whatever.
Sure.
Okay. So that's what you think. And then you look at the data, and there is this plot of the drum roaster behaving more or less as you'd expect. And the traditional one also behaving actually very nicely. Traditional one is a good example of what I'd expect. I'd make some acrylamide, and then as they start to go darker and darker, it'd be driven out of the pan. Now, the fluidized bed roaster. Okay, so you make a bunch of it, apparently, if you roast medium. But if you roast light, there's allegedly none.
Yeah.
Okay. Christopher, why is there none in this particular data set?
I don't know if I can answer that question. I mean, I see that the Harar basically didn't develop at all in their light roast. The Sadama, pretty similarly, we're at 94.6, and then we've got 81.1 in the Yurgachev. I don't know anything about chemistry, so I can't really answer this question for you.
Doran, you wanna speculate?
I'm gonna guess it's because they didn't do the chemical analysis properly.
They f***ed up.
Oh, that sounds good.
To that point, let's talk about how they messed up.
Well, if I were to actually guess at how they did this wrong, if you look at the method that they detect acrylamide by, it's UV vis spectroscopy. And part of UV vis spectroscopy, like everything absorbs light in some amount.
Sure.
And so whenever you take a spectrum of a sample, you first need to blank the spectrometer to like whatever the matrix is. So if you're like investigating a dye that's dissolved in water, you first take the spectrum of water, and then you're going to subtract that from the water plus the dye to give you only the spectrum of the dye. And whenever you see out of nowhere a 0 on your UV vis data, that almost always means that you accidentally blanked the sample. So you blanked the spectrophotometer with the sample in it, so that when you measured the sample, it looks like there's nothing in it.
Ouch.
This data set came to me in my laboratory. Well, first of all, it would not come to me. They try and rationalize this. They use words to try and talk their way through this. There's absolutely no explanation for this. Doran's going to talk you through a little bit of the supporting information. We're going to use this as a teaching moment for you, Christopher, about
I love it.
how to interpret the HPLC data here.
So this is the data that you get out of HPLC, which is high performance liquid chromatography. You're basically passing liquid through a column that has some packed beads in it, and then things elute at different times from the end of the column based on how polar they are. And then you have some UV vis detector at the end that measures when things come out. Right, that's the gist. And the first problem is that they don't assign any of their peaks, which is unfortunate, but you could dig through the references and figure out the elution order and guess what they're looking at. But whenever you want to make assignments of concentration, you have to integrate the area of the peak that you get out. So for this peak at the start, you see like they're integrating under it, and then there's another peak. And so what they do is they just draw a straight line that goes from the place where those two peaks meet down to the baseline, right? That's pretty common. You see it.
It's ugly,
often.
but it's fine.
Yeah. And but the interesting thing is over here on the right side, they don't do that. They have a Gaussian fit, so you can see that this line is actually like a curve,
Right.
instead of being a straight line down, which means that within the same chromatogram, they're using different integration techniques. But what's more of a problem is that...
Well, that's... Hold on. I'll just comment. That's a problem. Keep going.
What's more of a problem is that in other measurements that they use to build the same data set, they use wildly different integration techniques. So if you just compare this one, this is the drum roaster light and the drum roaster dark. This is like the same coffee. And then you can see that in the light sample, they're doing that just draw a straight line from the intersection of the peaks down to the baseline thing. And then for the very next one, they're instead integrating between the valleys. And then here they're drawing a straight line again. So that's different.
This is, well, first of all, that's illegal. Yeah.
And then,
this is so bad.
And then you can see in this other one, they do something which is even worse, because at least these are kind of consistent within each other, within the measurements, like they're kind of internally consistent. But in this one, on the fluidized bed light roast coffee, you can see that they're drawing down to a baseline, which is just completely not physical. It doesn't line up to anything, and the problem is that this is going to make this area, for whatever compound this is, massively higher than this area, even though it's the same compound.
And probably basically the same concentration. We just cannot know.
Because they don't integrate consistently, you can basically discard every piece of chemical analysis in this paper because there's no way to know if it's real or not.
Wow.
This is like a huge no-no in HPLC analysis. Like, the way that it's supposed to be done is you come up with a computer program that automatically integrates every peak exactly the same way every time, no matter what data set you're on. That way it's always consistent. So the fact that they've done the integration in this way means that you literally cannot trust a single piece of the quantitative chemical analysis.
So another way to say this is they wanted there to be a lot of a given compound in the light roast, and so they picked a baseline that enabled them to have a big number.
Oh.
And for the dark roast, they wanted it to have not a lot of a compound, so they picked a baseline that made it a smaller number.
Like a sin. Like, you cannot do this.
Yeah.
You cannot do this.
Well, that's not exactly science.
But
No.
this raises an interesting point, though, which is that Chris and I know to go and look for this. Whenever I'm reading this paper and they're talking about HPLC, my first thought is I need to go find the SI and I need to go find the chromatograms. But people that aren't, professional scientists, most of the time don't even know that these documents exist, which I don't think you found it.
No.
Or that you would even think that there's something in there that you need to go see. You would just trust the numbers that they put in the paper.
For the listeners that are going to tune in, at least to whatever stage of the pod this will end up being cut to, we will post photos of this SI and the problem with the baselines on Instagram. This will be the thing that I share from this paper. And although we've, unfortunately we called you in and you've got the first truly negative paper, what I actually want to do is give an executive sort of concluding remark of this paper and then go back to your expertise. So the concluding remark of this paper is that we can't trust any of their data. Fine. We definitely can't conclude whether it's better to use a fluidized bed or drum roaster from this data alone. Fine. Coffee's complicated, and it's really hard to design an experiment like this without controlling all of the things that you mentioned at the beginning, like first thinking about airflow and thinking about the mass of coffee you're roasting and inlet temperature and all these other things, right? And they tried. And I would say they did not succeed at satisfying what they aimed to do. We have this data set. We now know that we also probably shouldn't read into the data too much. And yet, at the same time, Christopher, you're doing this all the time. You're roasting coffees in different ways, trying to assess the quality of them and using that process to ascertain what you think is the best way of making a sample measurement, a small, like under 100-gram sample roast.
Sure.
And then extrapolating that quality that you get out of that to say, I'm going to spend $7 a pound on this because I know that when I put this in my bigger roaster, I'm going to be able to get something that tastes really good and is worth that money. Is that
sure?
So I think people in the industry do this a lot, and then a paper comes through that looks like this, and people read this, and without the discerning eye, they would maybe just feel self-validated that their roaster is doing well because it added some points on a couple of coffees compared to some other thing, without thinking about the data.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so with all that, what do you do? Like, what do you actually do? Your roastery. How do you go and buy coffee? You get a green coffee. You roast it how?
I use an air roaster, so I do roast in 50-gram batches at a time.
Yep. And then when you've decided the coffees you're going to be purchasing, what roaster do you then use on your sort of for scale up for production runs?
Yeah, my clients use various roasters, but I personally use a Stronghold, which is another air roaster.
Yeah, sure. So we're familiar with that. So it's quite a different technology to the ones your clients probably use, because the Strongholds can only go up to what's the big one do? The S9 does
8 kilos.
So yeah, so it's not like a 60-kilo roaster that you'd find in some of these sort of bigger spots. This is what people actually do, and people have been making the decisions about sample roasting and scaling up for forever.
No, but really interestingly, a lot of people do still have biases surrounding certain roasters. And again, I think it comes down to how those operators are using the machines. But I know, for example, a lot of importers don't like when roasters are using the Ikawa. They say it ruins their coffee.
Is that right?
Yes. So I'm seeing it a lot with the roast. A lot of people are struggling to get results that are replicable from their old roasters, or that taste familiar to them. And I think it just comes down to fundamentally not understanding how the technology is different, and how you need to apply heat differently.
Yeah, because you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe that all of these roasters in principle can produce quality roasts.
I believe that as well.
And that if one were to learn how to do this, and it's not something that can be done on a podcast, it's something that requires time, and people consult with you for exactly this reason, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so it's something that one cannot just simply talk about. It's something you need to do. When I read a scientific paper then that tries to help us with this, all that goes through my mind is, Christopher, I wish you wrote a paper.
Yeah.
Why don't you write the scientific article?
I'm too busy writing about everything else, I think. Yeah.
Well,
I mean, right now you got me thinking about the fact that, I buy a coffee based on my 50-gram sample that I receive, and I trust that I can scale that to a full batch. I actually was just running the math on, like, okay, so I get a representative sample, quote unquote, that is 1 kilo of a full container of coffee. Mm-hmm. How much is that actually representing? Turns out, like, if you took that same ratio to a single dose, 18-gram dose, it wouldn't even be 1 bean, you know?
Yeah.
So the whole myth of us being able to have a representative sample and scale things, that there's so much trust and heuristics and faith that goes into coffee.
Yeah, and you hear the stories time and time again of people who invest, in a shipping container worth of coffee, and it arrives, and the spot sample is different in terms of quality than the landed.
Yeah.
You hear about this all the time, right? This is just part of the industry.
Yeah. I mean, coffee, it's a seed. It's a living thing.
Yeah. All right. I don't want to offend these authors too much, because they're trying, obviously, to address what I think is actually an important question.
Mm.
but at the same time, they didn't manage to do it.
Yeah.
I would say a big takeaway from this paper is, things make it through peer review all the time, and depending on the quality of the journal, usually that's a very rigorous process, but sometimes it can't be. So whenever you see numbers in a paper, you should always, if you can, look at the actual data that it's coming from and decide if it makes sense or not. And in this case, it doesn't make sense.
I don't even understand the numbers necessarily, other than what you briefly walked me through, but just seeing that it's an incomplete data set. There was only, n equals 1 on all of these, some of them n equals 0. And
then trying to make statistical statements of cup quality with three tasters. With three tasters is it's not really sensical. But sometimes you see a paper and you're like, this is a good start. Like, this would be the good initial experiments for a bigger paper later on. If this got scaled up to 20 Q graders on a bunch of different coffees, and then they maybe just picked 2 roasters, I'm sure they would be able to see a difference, and that would be instructive for the industry at large.
All right. That's it. Thank you very much. We've taken enough of your time.
All right. Right on. Thanks.
See ya.